Hello, everyone. So, this is part three of my series, Why I Do Not Stand with Ukraine. And as a brief introduction, in part one, we discussed how Ukraine is a hive of propaganda on all sides. In part two, we discussed why there's so much propaganda and what some of the motivations are. What are we being pushed towards and manipulated to getting ourselves into with all this propaganda? And here we're going to do part three, things everyone needs to know about Ukraine. Those who are setting Ukraine up to be good guys that we Americans should be, supporting, going over there to fight for, and actively escalating a war on behalf of. Um, that narrative is more propaganda, and we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to tell you some things that you need to know, and hopefully this will make you realize the truth, which is that this is a war of evil against evil. As I mentioned in another video already, we have the West, which is the old New World Order, uh, challenging the East, which is the rising New World Order. Ultimately, the East is going to be victorious, and the West is going to fall. The Bible tells us that. And it's a war of evil against evil. And God often uses evil men and governments to judge other wicked nations that are more evil and whose time is up. And anyway, let's go ahead and just look through this. So right off the bat, let me just mention this video is not going to be as good as it could have been. Blacklisted news. So, well, in a sense, though, this will maybe be a good video if anyone felt that I was relying too heavily on blacklisted news, which I do. I love the site. Overall, they're doing a good job of thinking critically and exposing propaganda and fake news. Um, Blacklisted news was down for me today. I checked it and I was wondering, since I've been accessing it so much lately, maybe they did they just block me, thinking that I was, uh, part of a DDoS or something like that, since I've been literally pulling up hundreds of pages off of their website in the last couple days for doing these videos. But I checked, and then I tried accessing it through a proxy site. Blacklisted news does seem to be down right now for everyone, and that's really unfortunate because I had a lot of good stuff that actually I'd found in other places too. But since I didn't necessarily save all those resources, Blacklisted News was a great place to go as kind of a hub, and then branch back out to where I was before on some of these info snippets. So unfortunately, Blacklisted News being down is a big blow. Hopefully they'll be back up. I don't know what's going on with them. Um, are they down for maintenance? Just having a high volume of traffic, or is this an organized attack to take down another very rare source of truth in our increasingly dystopian, totalitarian reality? Fortunately, I had a page up in my browser that loaded right before the website apparently went down, and I managed to save it as a PDF, so we will talk about that one. Uh, and like I said, hopefully the site will be back up, and if you aren't on blacklisted news, you probably should be if you really want to understand what's going on. But in part one, we talked about propaganda, and here's a great example of that. This Russian hand grenade story. So basically, some Russian soldiers were sent in to give terms to a town in Ukraine, and one of these Russian guys had two hand grenades, one in each hand, presumably with the pins out. And so the cry or outrage was, "Oh, this guy's holding the whole town hostage with these hand grenades." Um, and whether this is actually real footage or not, I don't know. It's like I said, propaganda's everywhere. We're seeing a lot of recycled old footage from other conflicts, from other countries, even being used to support the war in Ukraine, and generally it's pro-Ukrainian propaganda that we're seeing in the West. So whether this is actually a real thing or not, I don't know. But this guy's not holding the town hostage. What he's actually doing in this situation, if this event actually took place the way we're told it did, he's he's guaranteeing his own life. We're being told that Ukrainians, even civilians, are being armed to fight against the Russians. At one point, I came across. Uh, I'm not sure if this is a real thing or not. There was a video circulating of Ukrainians who supposedly ambushed, killed, and dismembered some Russians. Don't know if that's a real thing or not, so I'm not really even going to talk about that too much. Maybe it is, and or maybe it's not, or maybe it's not, but Ukraine is intentionally feeding this propaganda to the Russians as well, so that they will, be a little more wary and back off on their invasion into Ukraine. Um, so I don't know exactly what's going on there, but the idea that this guy's holding hostage a whole town with two hand grenades is ludicrous. No, he is guaranteeing his own life because if someone tries to, if the mob tries to overwhelm him or what have you, he at least gets a quick death and gets to take some people with him. So this is sort of a mutually assured destruction sort of tactic where he's discouraging this group of potential combatants to just leave him alone and let him come in, give his message, and then leave without violence. But anyway, let's talk about this article that I was able to grab before it blacklisted news went down. So this article is 10 signs that the war in Ukraine is part of the Great Reset. I wish it had actually saved the full website header because there were some other really great articles that it would have been useful to have been able to just give you an overview of. But oh well. So we talked about this actually in my second video, and you'll see that many of these things are just right off of um, things that we discussed in that second video of what are we being pushed into and why. Oh, and one of the headlines that Blacklisted News had up today, one of the articles was about Klaus Schwab and how he's basically scrubbed Russia, Putin, and Putin from the WEF. I think that's World Economic Forum website. Schwab is he's one of these globalists, and so this just shows you that the Russians, although Russia and China have their own ideas about their own new world order, they're really standing in against the current old new world order, and the globalists are just frothing at the lips about this, and that's one reason why they want to escalate this conflict. Welcome to the second phase of the Great Reset, war. While the pandemic acclimatized the world to lockdowns, normalized the acceptance of experimental medications, precipitated the greatest transfer of wealth to corporations by decimating SMEs, and adjusted the muscle memory of workforce operations in preparation for a cybernetic future, an additional vector was required to accelerate the economic collapse before nations can, quote, build back better. The war between Russia and Ukraine is already causing unprecedented disruption to global supply chains, exacerbating food shortages and inducing chronic levels of inflation. And I talked about this. Currencies need to be absolutely trashed. People need to be desperate and starving because what happens then the globalists step in, save everybody. This is called Ordo ab Chao, or order out of chaos. This is a modus operandi, if you will, coming from Freemasonry. It's right out of the Luciferian global elites playbook. You generate chaos with one hand, and then you solve those problems with the other. But in solving them, You make yourself indispensable to the people and you gain more control for yourself. That's what's going on here. Um, I'm not going to go into great detail about all these points because we got to get into the main substance of this video. But therefore, the World Economic Forum's ominous prediction that we will own nothing and be happy by 2030 seems to be unfolding with horrifying rapidity. Yeah, that's where they want to take us. The war's economic fallout will lead to a dramatic downsizing of the global workforce. We're going to be replaced by robots. Not going to go into great detail on that, but actually 2025, a lot of jobs by then will be replaced with automation. And that's going to be a big problem because with all these people out of work and basically just being a burden on society, the elites who already, as I mentioned in part 2, who already want to bring the world population down to 500 million, there's just all this dead weight that needs to be culled. And so, these depopulation measures like the jabs and these intentionally released diseases, and I think smallpox is coming up. I hope you're ready for it. If we see smallpox, you heard it from me. You can quote me on this, that it's the West intentionally resurrecting it and releasing it on the people for purposes of population control. Or possibly they'll try to blame it on Russia as a false flag and an excuse to escalate a war which one recent uh, simulated scenario in 2018 postulated that could cost 1 billion lives around the world if war escalates in Ukraine and goes nuclear. The war has significantly reduced Europe's reliance on the Russian energy sector and reinforced the centrality of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and net zero emissions, which lies at the heart of the Great Reset. Net zero emissions, but I don't see the elites cutting back on their private jets, their private yachts, etc. It's going to be, they're creating two classes, the ruling elites, and those folks will have no rules, and then the rest of us who will be cattle. And they only intend to keep around as many of us as are necessary to serve them. As labor, as sex slaves, whatever. As cannon fodder, as we may well see a sort of what was that story? The most dangerous game sort of thing. Hunting humans for sport. Here are some of the developmental goals of the New World Order. Here is, as a flat earther, what I've talked about in other videos, we have the AE map on the UN flag. The AE map is the flat earth realm that we live in, and the elites know this. They just lie to us for various reasons. You might think I'm crazy on that, but, that's another thing. We're not getting into that right now. 4, food shortages. We talked about this in part 2. Created by the war will offer a major boon to the synthetic biology industry, as the convergence of digital technologies with materials science and biology will radically transform the agricultural sector and encourage the adoption of plant-based and lab-grown alternatives on a global scale. So we talked about genetically modified and genetically engineered foods, meat especially, in part 2. We talked about human meat that we can grow from our own cells using expired blood packs at home. And we talked about insects being normalized, especially by the EU right now, as a new food source instead of meat. Get ready for it. Soylent Green. Russia's exclusion from SWIFT let's see, foreshadows an economic reset which will generate precisely the kind of blowback necessary for corralling large swaths of the global population into a technocratic control grid. And this is also part of the whole energy thing. You can't travel as far with an electric car. And if the power grid goes down and there's no charging stations, you won't be able to travel far at all with an electric car. Whereas fuel, back in the day, fuel before they were adding ethanol, which is a perishable, and so it makes fuel and have a shelf life basically. Prior to that, you could store up ethanol-free gas, and you could have this sort of uncontrolled means of traveling extremely long distances. And there's no way of really keeping someone from filling up, 15 5-gallon uh, gas containers in their car and just, cruising 1,000 miles or whatever. Um, Now it's pretty hard to find ethanol free gas. The intentional suppression of American energy independence and the rise of fuel prices, it's all about control and keeping people from traveling as much. They don't want us traveling around. They don't want us unaccounted for and unsupervised. They want this technocratic control grid. They want us to be stuck in our hometowns and be cattle. You want to keep cattle in a corral, in a pasture. You don't want to let them roam too far afield where they can't be located when you need them for whatever. And unfortunately, this whole excluding Russia from SWIFT basically forced them to participate in China's equivalent, increasing that rift between East and West. We talked about this already. And basically facilitating or pushing Russia towards this rising Eastern coalition of powers. We're digging our own grave here because the Western Luciferian globalist elites, they've miscalculated. They've miscalculated how this is going to turn out. This war marks a major inflection point in the globalist aspiration for a new international rules-based order anchored in Eurasia. They're ultimately going to fail in this, but yes, we talked about that as well, that the US needs to be brought down because they're too independent and too powerful, and Russia needs to be humbled and brought down as well because they're too independent, resisting the New World Order. And so they need to be humbled and brought down so they can be brought into the New World Order fold. Ultimately, this is not going to work, but that's one thing that's going on. With speculation mounting over the war's long-term impact on bilateral trade flows between China and Europe, the Russia-Ukraine conflict will catapult Israel, a leading advocate of the Great Reset, to even greater international prominence. And we've already seen that Zelensky reached out to Israel, asking them to mediate. And humorously, Israel said, hey, just accept the peace terms that Putin put out because they're actually really good. And that's what he should have done if he had any intention of seeking peace for Ukraine, but he doesn't. Zelensky answers to someone else. And his globalist masters want an escalated conflict there. Because it does all the things like population culling and equalization and giving power to the New World Order, the Western New World Order, like we talked about in part 2. It is now common knowledge that digital IDs are a central plank in the World Economic Forum's Great Reset agenda and are to be streamlined across industries, supply chains, and markets as a way of advancing the UN 2030 SDGs and delivering individualized and integrated services in future smart cities. Tracking, control, and also there will be a health aspect to these digital IDs. We're seeing a lot of them being rolled out as health credentials, some of them implantable in some countries. As we mentioned, this will be tied to a future digital currency, world currency. So this stuff is coming from the Western New World Order, Western society. Ultimately, what's going to happen is the East is going to rise, the United States is going to fall, the West will decline and be conquered. But eventually we're going to get back to this point. There will be some kind of mark of the beast system, and it likely does include an implantable digital ID. It likely does include health aspects of, requiring jabs and other things that will actually modify the human base organism. And it will have a financial aspect where you won't be able to buy, sell, or participate in society without this implant, and that is the mark of the beast that we see in the scriptures. All right, so moving on. Europe is directly in line of fire once a hybrid war between NATO and the Sino-Russian axis is underway. Yeah, that's definitely true. And the economic implications of this war will be so disastrous that governments and the public sector will require a significant injection of private capital to address the financing shortfall. Yep, yep, and arguably banks and the super rich already control the governments. This is just sort of sealing the deal, if that makes sense. Sealing the deal and putting those governments more directly under the control of the oligarchy, the ruling globalist elites. All right, let's get back to the main purpose of this part 3, things everyone needs to know about Ukraine. Firstly, there have been numerous revolutions, and it's a highly divided nation. Common knowledge. Let me just say that I do not think that unity needs to be forced at all costs. Right now, the United States federal government is so absolutely corrupt and so totalitarian and antithetical to the um, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the American people. I don't think that the Union can or should be sustained any longer. I am a secessionist. I think that conservatives and patriots in this country need to peacefully secede, and it's my hope that God will give us a new republic. We do know that a civil war is coming in America, probably within the next 2 decades. Um, so this idea, the fact that there have been numerous revolutions, I believe 3 at least in my lifetime, just shows that this division is there. The country is very divided, and it would make sense to subdivide it a little bit so that people have a choice whether they want to be in Russian administrated areas or an independent Ukraine. Before Russia even crossed the border into Ukraine, thousands of Ukrainian civilians were dead at the hands of other Ukrainians. I had a great bombardment map that showed shelling of Ukrainian civilians, by Ukrainian militia groups and splinter factions and all this other stuff. 14,000 dead. I had a great map of this, but unfortunately, I'm not sure how to relocate it with blacklisted news being down. Uh, but there is an article on the war in here we have the casualties 14 yeah. Maybe I got that wrong. Maybe it wasn't 14,000 killed all in all, but I don't know what the time frame is that they lay this out. Anyway, the war in the Donbass, a lot of this shelling and these civilian deaths were in these separatist regions. You can read that for yourself. Um, so one thing you should know about Ukraine is they have the only Nazi military unit in the world, the Azov Battalion. Um, this is pretty interesting stuff, and the Azov Battalion actually has ties to extreme militant rightist groups in the United States. There were 2 different articles, I think, on Blacklisted News about their connections to the January 6th events and how they were there instigating and trying to stir up violence. And that's not the first time that they've tried to stir up violence and instigate race wars here in the U.S., which is really alarming to me. But these guys, they're Nazis. Look at this symbology. It comes from the 2 lightning bolts of the SS. This is their insignia. and they are an openly Nazi unit. And so Putin stated that one of his goals was the denazification of Ukraine. And guess what? Yes, there are real Nazis there. Azov has links there to violent acts against immigrants, gypsies, and transvestites. Gateway Pundit has run several articles on them recently. And then there are ties between these guys and the U.S. State Department. These articles are interesting. You can check out all these links and stuff for yourself. Azov Battalion, they're real Nazis. And here we've got some of these guys, Nazi flag and the Azov Battalion flag. Oh, interesting. Victoria Nuland, the woman who has helped to design a plan for long-term guerrilla warfare in Ukraine if the government falls, and the woman who admitted that the U.S. has numerous U.S. bioweapons facilities in Ukraine. Interesting. And she has ties to this Azov Battalion as well. I didn't notice that she was part of all this initially. Yeah, but you can look through that stuff on your own. Azov Battalion. I will say, propaganda. I don't want to go above and beyond, so I'm going to be very careful to point something out. So there was this story about Azov Battalion participating in a crucifixion and burning alive of a pro-separatist. It seems that that crucifixion video may have originated, it may have been staged, and it may have originated with Russian state media and have been propaganda. And the Azov Battalion has disavowed that particular event, although their connection to other, trying to instigate other violent situations is demonstrable, as well as violent attacks on certain other people. But that crucifixion does not seem, or at least I couldn't prove to myself that it really happened. And so I think that was probably propaganda coming from Russian state media. So I will say that I do want to be careful to speak the truth here and not go too far in either direction. Zelensky is a Luciferian pervert. Yeah, so this guy is he's a former comedian. He's a globalist installee. He definitely has handlers that he answers to. And so here's a picture of him. Hopefully the volume won't pop on me. Yes, good. I already muted this. There's a video of him dressed in black form-fitting bondage-like apparel, wearing high heels, dancing around with a bunch of other men, and making all kinds of highly sexualized gestures, mouth gestures. I don't speak Russian, so I have no idea what these guys are saying, but clearly this is perversion. Yeah, this is Zelensky. If you do I think what I searched for was Zelensky transvestite video on DuckDuckGo, and this came up. I don't know. Maybe this is just intended to be funny or whatever, but yeah, it's just disturbing and disgusting. I'm not even going to show the whole thing. Let's get out of this, and I will scrub that from my computer and my mind. He's also a liar, as we already talked about in our former videos about propaganda. Then we have a Ukrainian PM talking about how we fight for the NWO, the New World Order. Let's watch that video.
Shield for the Europe.
For the rest of us that aren't Ukrainians, I think the world, quite frankly, Kira, is surprised by the will of the Ukrainian people to stand up and fight. Are you?
Well, I'm not surprised. We have been fighting Putin for the last 8 years, and we had three revolutions in our country when we did not agree with what was going on with the direction of where we're moving in. But right now, it's a critical time because we know that we not only fight for Ukraine, we fight for this new world order for the democratic countries. We knew that we are the
So there we go. Democracy. We already talked about that. It's a Pavlovian trigger word designed to rile you up and manipulate you. The United States is not a democracy. Oligarchs rule the West. There aren't really any true democratic nations in the West. It's just another lie. Democracy and the New World Order are kind of inextricably linked, and she outright says that we're fighting for the New World Order. And that makes sense because these New World Order proponents like Soros and like Schwab and others um, support escalating the conflict in Ukraine. So what else does Ukraine fight for? According to an MI6 chief in a recent tweet, um, this fellow wrote, with the tragedy and destruction unfolding so distressingly in Ukraine, we should remember the values and hard-won freedoms that distinguish us from Putin, done more than LGBT whatever rights. So what else does Ukraine fight for? They fight for the rainbow agenda. On Russian TV, homosexual acts are not allowed to be shown. Putin has criticized the West for our moral decadence and the decline of the nuclear family, and he has said that God's on Russia's side. God's not on the side of the West. God is on Russia's side. And while I don't always agree with what Putin says, and I don't think that God is necessarily on Putin's side, I do think that God has raised him up and that he's going to give them victory over us because of our wickedness. And in some ways, yes, Russian society is more moral than we are in the West. Oh, yes, Al Qaeda fights with Ukraine. Are you starting to see all the problems here with the narrative that you've been sold? Hundreds of Al Qaeda militants arrive in Ukraine from Syria. The Al Qaeda militants arrived just days after Russian intelligence warned that Washington was providing them with training for the fight in Ukraine. Now, if you know anything about the origins of Al Qaeda, the CIA actually created them to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. Fact. Fact. And you can look into that for yourself. I knew that long before this whole Ukraine situation even popped up. Now, I think at some point Al Qaeda split off, and I don't think that they're necessarily as easily controlled a CIA asset as they used to be back in the day. But because they have this very, this long-term conflict with Russia, these militants that have been associated with Al Qaeda are arriving in Ukraine to fight for the Ukrainians against the Russians. Around 450 militants from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Yeah. Anyway, so some strange bedfellows, Nazis and Al Qaeda, Islamic extremists coming together to fight for Ukraine, who says that they fight for the New World Order. Then we have the problem of war crimes. Oh, yeah. War crimes on both sides, obviously. As I said in both parts 1 and part 2, I'm no Russian apologist and I'm not taking Putin's side. This is a war of evil against evil. And my position is that the United States needs to just stay out of this and do whatever we can to encourage both sides to de-escalate. And Lord willing, we'll be given a measure of peace for a time, but honestly, I don't know that we are moving in that direction because the globalists want a full World War III situation. But freeing prisoners and arming them to go fight and die against trained Russian troops That's probably a war crime, and that's not something you do unless you're desperate. Ukraine's putting out this narrative that they're fighting Russia, that they're having so much success, that they're dominating, that Russia's lost thousands and thousands of troops. Uh, it's really a false narrative and intended to stir up sympathy and support from the West. They're actually desperate. They're arming prisoners. They're arming citizens. They gave out 25,000 automatic weapons to basically anyone who wanted them. Let me see. There's a snippet here that I'll read, maybe. They're preventing people of military age from leaving the country. This narrative says that Ukrainian men and women have volunteered in droves to get weapons and learn how to defend their country. Actually, there's a lot of fighting in Kiev right now, and it's militant infighting. The Russians haven't tried to really go into the city and take it. That would require tremendous effort and going street to street or shelling the city into submission first, and Russia doesn't want to do that. Yeah, a lot of people are getting guns because times are dangerous, and there's all these factions and criminal organizations that are using these weapons to settle their own scores. This is just madness what they're doing. Absolute madness, and encouraging untrained civilians to go out and fight against Russian troops. It's just crazy. Absolutely crazy. The one Ukrainian military command also put out this statement, don't to directed at Russian troops, don't bother to surrender, we're just going to slaughter you like pigs. Yeah, that's another war crime right there. And kind of a dumb thing to say, honestly. Yeah, it was Ukraine Special Operations Command. This is just, I had a better source of this than this website, but with Blacklisted News down, I was unable to find it. And anyway, this site just kind of recaptures it anyway. From now on, there will be no more captured Russian artillerymen. No mercy, no please do not kill, I surrender, will not pass. Each calculation, no matter. Commander, driver, gunner, loader will be slaughtered like pigs. Piss in your pants, we've already come for you. Call your mom one last time, say you'll die soon, Jackal. Yeah. This is kind of a dumb thing to tell your enemy, because basically they're just saying, fight to the death. Don't be taken alive. But there you go. And then you look at, we already talked about how Ukraine's actual political and military establishment are a primary source of lies and propaganda. They're untrustworthy. We talked about that a lot in video 1 and in part 1 and part 2. And then who is pro-Ukraine? Who's actually, waving the flag and cheerleading for the Ukrainians? Well, George Soros, the Clintons, Schwab. Soros and Schwab are evil globalists, New World Orders, New World Order types. The Clintons, scum, murderous scumbags. George Soros, U.S. and European Union must remove Putin and Z, or however you pronounce that, from power before they can destroy our civilization. So he's advocating for removing Putin and the Chinese dictator from power. Yeah, because they are a big threat to his plans and everything he's worked for his whole life. So he's coming out, and he's actually wanted in Russia. So if they prevail, they might actually deliver some justice to that scumbag. George Soros and Hillary Clinton are cheering on war with Russia. Well, if that doesn't make me rethink supporting Ukraine, I mean, yeah, just look at who stands with Ukraine. Not the good guys. They're not good guys. This is a fight of evil against evil. Let me just say again, My thoughts and prayers go out to the Ukrainian people and to the Russian people. Their governments are a mess. The people in power don't stand for the people's best interests, and the people are really just suffering in both countries in some ways. The conflict isn't actually in Russia, but those protesting it are being arrested. And then obviously Russian soldiers are dying and suffering because of what's going on here. So just pray for peace, de-escalation, and a resolution to this situation. That is really what we as Americans need to be speaking for and working towards and encouraging our leadership to stand for. We do not want to escalate this conflict. We do not want World War III. We do not want the death and suffering that would bring, all for the sake of giving more power and more money to the globalist, Luciferian elite scumbags who are pulling strings from behind the scenes. Well, thank you for watching. Lord willing, I'll be doing another part of this video, which is what has actually been happening during the Ukraine invasion. And if you've been absorbing nothing but propaganda, you probably don't know some of these things. And I don't know how long that video will be, but we'll, Lord willing, give it a shot if I have time to do that. And thank you for watching. God bless.